So I often talk about sunlight being free energy for the body. But what does that mean? And is this actual usable energy that we can do to support things like our metabolism? And I'm here to say that absolutely it is. Now, I want to break this down a little bit. And in order to break it down, I want you to understand a couple of different concepts. First and foremost, we have to understand that there's different wavelengths of sunlight, and we actually absorb a couple of different ones for energy for different purposes. First and foremost, I talk a ton about exclusion zone water, and that is the heat-based version of infrared. It will be absorbed into the exclusion zone water and basically charge that water battery up. Remember, that is actually synonymous with maintaining the healthy negative charge inside of our cells. So we have to be able to utilize sunlight directly on the skin in order to be able to help expand and maintain that healthy negative charge in the cell. And that's in the infrared range. Remember, the infrared range is present from sunrise all the way through solar noon to sunset. So we have access to that infrared light at all times of the day. Now, there's another wavelength range of light that we also absorb and utilize to give us free energy, and that would be the ultraviolet end. And this is the wavelength range that we've been taught to fear, that it's harmful, it's going to create damage, it's going to drive cancer. And yet we now know that we can actually derive free energy from the more intense wavelengths of ultraviolet light. So what gives? Why would we be able to harness energy from something that is supposedly out to get us? And so to understand this particular aspect of it, I want to break down the concept of something called POMC. So here we go. I'm going to share my screen because I think it's helpful to see. All right, so what you're looking at, I want to orient you. This is a slide from Dr. Alexander Wunsch. He's also known as the light doctor, and I've really loved all the work that he's been putting out on POMC and so many aspects of how our body is influenced directly by light. But in particular, we have what's called a 241 amino acid peptide or protein, essentially, called POMC. So picture amino acids as just like the bricks. Each amino acid is a brick, and you string these bricks together, and you string a specific sequence of 241 of them together, and you get the protein called POMC. POMC is short for pro-opiomelanocortin. So in case you're interested, otherwise I'm going to refer to it as POMC. And POMC is produced inside of the brain, and it's produced on our skin. So what happens with POMC? Well, POMC, this gigantic protein essentially, can get cut. You can cut it at certain places. And when you cut it at certain places, you actually start to get what are called metabolites of it. So if you look at the top left where it says POMC 241 amino acids, you'll see that POMC, it can get cut into a tiny portion that's called gamma MSH. It can be cut into a more medium-sized portion called ACTH. That ACTH can get cut and become alpha MSH and clip. The larger portion can become beta lipotropin or gamma gamma lipotropin or beta endorphin, or then ultimately beta MSH. So all of those are metabolites of POMC getting cut. In order for POMC to be stimulated in the first place, and then to help dictate how it's going to get cut, we need ultraviolet light, specifically the more intense wavelengths of ultraviolet light, the more intense ultraviolet A into the ultraviolet B spectrum. This will stimulate POMC to be produced and then help it to get cut. And if it gets cut in key ways, it can actually help with fat burning and appetite suppression. Okay, so why would this be? Well, number one, if you take a look at the list right there. If you take a look, if we cleave it into something called lipotropin, that stimulates lipolysis. Lipolysis is the burning of fat. So it essentially stimulates the body to say, yeah, we can burn fat for a fuel source. If it gets cut as into the alpha MSH pathway, it suppresses appetite and helps to regulate energy homeostasis. So why? How is it that light would regulate appetite or regulate energy homeostasis? In my understanding of how these pathways intersect, yes, we're getting some from the maintaining exclusion zone water. That's one source of energy that's essential to maintain through light. But if we also can derive energy in our body, free energy, through melanin. Melanin is a pigment on our skin that's also, oh, guess what, stimulated by alpha MSH. the MSH pathway in order to essentially create a darkening of the skin in response to ultraviolet light. So what happens here is as ultraviolet light strikes the melanin in our skin, the water molecule that surrounds all of melanin, remember all of the molecules in our body are surrounded by what's called a hydration shell of this structured water, like exclusion zone structured water. When melanin absorbs light, it splits a water molecule. And that splitting of the water molecule turns the water molecules into molecular hydrogen. And that molecular hydrogen, we know, can go directly to the mitochondria to stimulate more water and ATP production, essentially more energy production in the mitochondria. We also know that ultraviolet light can also get absorbed by the exclusion zone water. And when ultraviolet light is absorbed into the exclusion zone water, it actually increases the negative charge in a way that generates what has been called in the literature a plasma of free electrons, meaning we're deriving free charge or free energy from sunlight. We're very much like plants, right? We can undergo photosynthesis as well. But unfortunately, we've been taught to fear the light. And in order to derive these benefits, we have to be able to teach our skin how to systematically layer on more and more intense light sources so we can actually get energy from light. It's absolutely possible. I've had many people after they experience a light exposure or start to build that light tell me that they have appetite suppressing effects or appetite regulating effects. Why would we need to go out to hunt and find and gather food if instead we can signal satiety because we've gotten adequate energy from the sun? You layer in earthing as well as another source of energy, and it just makes sense why we can. It's a misnomer that the only way that we get energy is through food. Now, this doesn't even take into consideration the fact that we have certain pathways that negatively get stimulated under artificial light. So we've got pathways that can actually increase blood sugar. That ACTH pathway, when we have excessive blue light exposure, this toxic blue light exposure, we'll see an increase in ACTH. That ACTH will actually drive up blood glucose levels. So when it's not in its balanced form from sunlight, and we're not deriving the adequate energy from it, we're actually going to, and we consume light, if you will, in its processed artificial source, we can actually use light to the detriment of our metabolism. So why? Let's tie this in. Well, we know that blue light can inhibit cytochrome C oxidase. That's the step where the mitochondria turn electrons and hydrogen and oxygen into water. Water that's inside of the cell gets structured into this exclusion zone water and becomes this beautiful battery of energy that we maintain through infrared light exposure. So if we're inhibiting that water production, we're essentially inhibiting our a main source of cellular energy. So instead, then the body says, well, we have to then now switch to an alternative fuel source and start to derive energy from glucose. So the liver will start a process called gluconeogenesis to increase glucose production so that glucose can get delivered to the mitochondria to hopefully facilitate that energy production pathway again. So, it's all interrelated. It's very fascinating when you start to understand these pathways, but it's also very unfortunate when you realize that we've been taught to fear the sunlight, as opposed to learn how to slowly build up a solar adaptation to the light so that we can withstand greater and greater ultraviolet light exposures and actually derive benefit from it instead of harm. Now, I haven't even talked about how ultraviolet light can lower blood pressure or how ultraviolet light makes vitamin D. And that vitamin D pathway cannot be, you cannot get the same vitamin D metabolites through a supplement as you can get through the building vitamin D through the skin. There's literally dozens more metabolites we'll make when we make it through the sun that are very, very beneficial, anti-cancer, for example. And so I want you to learn how to embrace this springtime, which is an ideal time to build this solar adaptation so that all spring, summer, and fall long, you can absorb free energy from sunlight and use it for the health of your body, the health of your mitochondria. Use it as a source of energy as opposed to fearing it. And when we fear it, we really divorce ourselves from absolutely essential healing and even nutrients or nourishment, solar nourishment that were designed to get through our skin when it comes to sunlight striking the skin. So I highly encourage you to learn how to build a solar adaptation. And I will be teaching just that in my upcoming Spring Reset Challenge. It is, I've heard time and time again of people who have just been introduced to my work through that 14-day spring reset challenge, who then went on to embrace light all summer, all spring, summer, and fall, and then come to me in my community and tell me how beneficial it was. Or I've been interviewed by people on podcasts who say that was their entry point into learning how to use light for their health and their benefit. And they, just derive such a benefit from it that they wanted to continue to learn more and more. And so it's just such a beautiful way to start to understand that the light is not out to get us. The light can heal us, and it can actually be free energy for us. Human photosynthesis is what a researcher named Dr. Arturo Solis Herrera has called it. And I firmly believe it is something that we need to optimize instead of fear.